The council chamber had gone completely silent the moment they dragged her in. Molly kept her eyes on the stone floor, counting the cracks between the heavy flagstones beneath her worn boots. She had learned long ago that looking up too quickly in a room full of powerful men was the fastest way to earn a bruise. The gray wool of her cloak, frayed at the hem, patched at the left shoulder, smelled of pine smoke and river mud from the road she had traveled for 3 days straight. Her braid hung heavy and damp against her back. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were steady. That was the only part of her she could still control. "She is the one who crossed the northern boundary," said the guard to her left. His voice bounced off the vaulted stone ceiling and came back smaller somehow, caught her at the ridge marker before dawn. A murmur rolled through the room. Molly heard the scrape of heavy chairs, the clink of belt buckles, the soft creak of leather armor. She counted at least 9 men in the chamber without lifting her gaze. She had developed a talent for counting things she wasn't supposed to see. "An omega," someone said, and the word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, with ripples that spread outward and changed everything they touched. Unclaimed by the look of her. No pack markings. "No pack at all," the guard corrected. Another murmur, darker this time. Molly finally raised her eyes. Not because she had decided to be brave. She had run out of bravery somewhere around the 2nd day on the road, when her last piece of dried bread had crumbled to dust at the bottom of her satchel. She raised her eyes because she needed to understand the shape of the danger she was standing inside. The chamber was large and cold. Tall iron candelabras stood at the corners, their candles burning low, dripping wax onto the stone floor in slow, patient rivers. Maps hung on the walls, enormous detailed maps drawn in dark ink on heavy parchment, covered in markings she didn't immediately recognize. A long oak table ran the length of the room, and around it sat 8 men in varying states of authority and impatience. At the far end of the table stood the 9th. He wasn't sitting. He was standing with his back to her, studying one of the maps on the wall, with the focused stillness of a man who had learned that motion was a form of weakness. He wore black leather armor with crossed chest straps and a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders, dark as a winter sky before snowfall. His hair was long, pulled back in tight braids that fell between his shoulder blades. His hands were clasped behind his back, and even from across the room she could see the old scars crossing his forearms below the leather bracers. She knew who he was. Everyone in every territory within 3 mountain ranges knew who he was. King Evander, the Iron Wolf, the last Alpha King to unite the fractured northern packs under a single law. The man that border lords spoke of in lowered voices and council members mentioned only when they were certain he was not in the next room. He had not turned around yet. She was carrying this. The guard stepped forward and placed something on the oak table with a heavy sound. A leather satchel, buckle worn smooth, the strap repaired 3 times with different thread. Maps. Old ones. Border charts of the Ashfin territories. That made the king turn around. He did it slowly, the way very large and very certain things move, without hurry, without uncertainty, as though the world would simply wait for him. His eyes found her immediately. They were a pale, striking blue, the color of ice over a deep river, and they held an intelligence that she felt in her chest before she fully processed it in her mind. He said nothing for a long moment. Molly did not look away. She wasn't sure what compelled her to hold his gaze. Pride, perhaps, or exhaustion so complete that fear had temporarily lost its footing. "Your name," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, quieter. It didn't need volume to fill the room. "Molly." She paused. "Of no pack, as they said. What were you doing at the northern ridge?" "Trying to cross it." Another murmur from the table. One of the council members, a broad man with a gray-streaked beard and a scar across his chin, made an impatient sound. "She's an Omega without allegiance crossing a military boundary with detailed border maps. The answer is obvious, my king. She is a spy sent by..." I wasn't asking you, Doran. The king's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The council member closed his mouth. Evander walked around the table toward her, and the room shifted the way rooms do when the most dangerous thing in them begins to move. He stopped a few feet away, studying her the way she imagined he studied those maps on his wall, looking for what was true beneath what was visible. She was 23 years old, and she had been walking for 72 hours on an empty stomach, and her boots had a hole in the left sole that let the cold in like an unwanted companion. She was aware of exactly how she must look standing before the iron wolf of the north, like something the forest had tried to swallow and then reconsidered. "Those maps," he said. "Where did you get them?" "I drew them." That stopped him. A brief pause, almost imperceptible. "Yourself." "Over 4 years. I traveled the border territories and recorded what I found." She kept her voice flat and even. "I'm a cartographer. Or I was, before my pack dissolved, and the guild that employed me decided an Omega without a pack affiliation was a liability they couldn't afford." Evander looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up her satchel from the table and opened it himself, pulling out the folded parchment maps one by one, spreading the first across the table without ceremony. He studied it for 7 seconds. She counted. She couldn't help it. She counted everything. 7 seconds. Then he looked up. "This is the most accurate border survey of the Ashven Ridge that I have ever seen," he said, "including the ones my own scouts produced." The council chamber was silent. "And you want to cross into the Northern Territory," he said. It wasn't a question. "I want to reach the Coldwater settlements. I have family there, a sister." She kept her chin level. "She sent word 3 months ago that the settlement is in trouble. Supply routes cut off. Something wrong with the council leadership. I don't know what exactly. The letter was damaged." She paused. "I've been trying to get north ever since." Evander folded the map carefully, more carefully than she expected, and placed it back in her satchel. He handed the satchel back to her directly, which was apparently unusual enough that 2 council members exchanged a glance. "You'll stay in the keep tonight," he said. "You'll be given a room, food, and a fire. Tomorrow morning you'll present your maps to my head scout, Commander Sarah." He turned back toward his end of the table. "And then we'll discuss what you know about the Coldwater settlements, and what my scouts have been unable to discover." "And if I refuse?" The words were out before she had decided to say them. Every man in the room looked at her. Evander paused mid-step. He turned his head, just slightly, not enough to fully face her, but enough to show her the edge of his profile, the unhurried angle of a man who was not accustomed to the question. "You crossed a military boundary without authorization, carrying classified territorial maps," he said. "If you refuse, you'll spend tonight in the lower cells instead of a warm room, and we'll have the same conversation tomorrow with considerably less courtesy." A pause. "But you won't refuse." "How do you know that?" "Because your sister is in danger, and you've been walking for 3 days to reach her." His voice was even, almost quiet. "People willing to do that don't stop for comfort." He walked back to his end of the table. The council members shifted in their seats, recalibrating. Molly stood in the center of the room with her damp cloak and her empty stomach and her repaired satchel, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular, precarious sensation of being accurately seen by someone who was not supposed to look that closely. She didn't know what to do with it. A guard appeared at her elbow to escort her out, and she went. But at the threshold of the chamber door, she heard the council member named Doran speak again, low and pointed, clearly intended for the king's ears. "She's an Omega without a pack, my king. A mapmaker with no allegiance and no protection. Whatever she knows, we can extract it without—" "Touch her maps," Evander said, without looking up. and you will need a new position by morning. Touch her, and you will need considerably more than that." The door closed behind Molly before she could hear what followed. She walked down the cold stone corridor with the guard's torch casting long shadows on the walls, and she pressed one hand briefly against the strap of her satchel, the maps she had spent 4 years of her life making, and tried very hard not to read too much into the words of a man she had known for less than 10 minutes. She failed. The room they gave her was not a cell. That was the first thing Molly registered when the guard pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped aside to let her pass. She had prepared herself, somewhere in the corridor between the council chamber and wherever they were taking her, for stone walls and iron bars, and the particular smell of places where people were kept against their will. She had spent one night in a place like that already, 6 months ago, in a border town whose name she had since tried to forget, and the memory of it sat in her chest, like a cold stone she carried everywhere. But this room had a bed with a wool blanket, a fireplace with a fire already burning in it, small and steady, a wooden table with a clay pitcher of water and a plate covered with a cloth, one narrow window with a view of the keep's inner courtyard, where torchlight moved in slow patterns against the dark. The guard said nothing. He simply left, and the door didn't lock behind him. Molly stood in the center of the room for a full minute without moving. Then she set her satchel down on the table, lifted the cloth from the plate, and ate every piece of bread and cold meat and dried fruit that had been left for her, slowly and methodically, standing up because sitting down felt too much like relaxing, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. When the plate was empty, she sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her left boot and looked at the hole in the sole, ragged-edged, roughly the size of a large coin, and tried to decide what she thought about King Evander. She reached no useful conclusion before exhaustion made the decision for her, and she slept. She woke to the sound of voices in the courtyard below. Gray morning light pressed through the narrow window. The fire had burned down to red coals that breathed with slow heat. Molly rose, splashed water from the clay pitcher onto her face, rebraided her hair with hands that were still slightly stiff from the cold, and put on her boots, hole and all. A different guard came for her at mid-morning. A woman this time, broad-shouldered, wearing the dark leather and iron insignia of the king's personal guard. She introduced herself as nothing and said only, "Commander Sarah is waiting," and led Molly through a series of stone corridors that went deeper into the keep than she had yet traveled. Commander Sarah's workspace was not what Molly expected of a military scout's headquarters. She had imagined weapon racks and battle diagrams. What she found instead was a room so full of maps and parchment rolls and ink-stained reference books that it looked more like a scholar's chaos than a soldier's order. The woman herself was seated behind a heavy oak desk, leaning over a spread of parchment with a quill in one hand and an expression of focused irritation on her face. She was perhaps 40, with cropped dark hair, sharp eyes the color of old copper, and a scar that traced the line of her left jaw from ear to chin. She looked up when Molly entered, looked her over once, quickly, thoroughly, and pointed to the chair across the desk without ceremony. "Sit. Show me the Ashfin Ridge survey first." Molly sat. She opened her satchel, located the correct map by touch. She had organized them by region, and she knew their order the way she knew her own heartbeat, and spread it across the desk. Sarah studied it. She didn't speak for a long time. Her quill tapped a slow, irregular rhythm against the edge of the desk, the only indication that her mind was moving quickly behind that still face. "You marked the secondary water crossings," Sarah said finally. "The ones that aren't visible until the snow melt. How did you know they were there?" "I went in early spring. The ground tells you where water runs beneath it if you know how to read the frost patterns and the way certain grasses lean." Sarah looked up from the map. Her copper eyes were measuring. "My scouts have passed that ridge 11 times in 4 years. They missed those crossings every time." "Your scouts were probably moving too quickly," Molly said, and then caught herself. "I mean, Military scouts have objectives. I had nothing but time and curiosity. It's a different kind of attention." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the slight recalibration of someone revising an assumption. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms and regarded Molly with something closer to consideration than suspicion. "The king told me this morning that your maps of the Ashvin boundary are better than anything we've produced in-house," she said. "That is not a thing he says." "He said that?" "He said it once, at dawn, in a tone that suggested he was annoyed about it." And the corner of Sarah's mouth moved barely. "Which means he meant it." Molly looked down at the map spread across the desk. 4 years of walking and watching and recording, reduced to ink on parchment. But suddenly, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the ink felt like it meant something to someone who had the power to act on it. "Tell me about Coldwater," Sarah said, and her voice shifted, still direct, but with a new edge of careful attention beneath it. "What do you know?" "Only what my sister wrote. She's a healer there. Her name is Petra. She's been in the settlements for 2 years. Molly pressed her hands flat on the edge of the desk, grounding herself. The letter was water-damaged and parts were missing, but what I could read was clear enough. She said the supply routes from the southern passes had been cut. No grain, no medicine. She said the settlement council was making decisions that didn't make sense, turning away traders who had supplied them for years, restricting movement in and out without explanation. When was the letter dated? 11 weeks ago. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. The Coldwater settlements are 3 days into the Northern Territory from here, assuming clear roads. She paused. The roads are not clear. There's been early snow in the high passes, and we've had 2 scouting teams go north in the last month that reported unusual activity near the settlement boundaries. Molly felt the cold stone in her chest shift. Unusual how? "That," said a voice from the doorway, "is the question we've been trying to answer." Both women looked up. Evander stood in the doorway of Sarah's map room, still in his dark leather armor, the fur mantle gone now, his long braids falling loose over his shoulders. He carried himself the same way he had in the council chamber, with that particular quality of absolute stillness that made the space around him seem to rearrange itself in acknowledgement. In one hand, he held a folded piece of parchment. He crossed to the desk, unfolded the parchment, and laid it over Molly's Ashvin map without asking. It was a letter. Short, written in a hurried hand, the ink pressed too hard into the parchment in the way of someone writing quickly and under stress. Molly read it in silence. The settlement council answers to someone we do not know. The traders they turned away were not turned away. They were detained. There are wolves in the northern wood that do not answer to the king's law. Do not send anyone small. Do not send anyone alone. The letter was unsigned. "One of my contacts inside the Northern Territory," Evander said, "received 4 days ago." He looked at Molly. "Your sister's settlement is specifically named in the following paragraph, which I've removed for reasons of source protection, but the content is consistent with what you've described." Molly set the letter down carefully. Her hands were steady. She was very proud of her hands. "You believe there's a rogue faction operating inside the northern settlements?" she said. "I believe there is something operating inside the northern settlements that has gone to considerable trouble to remain invisible." Evander picked up the letter and refolded it. "My scouts can track movement and map terrain. They are very good at finding what is where." He paused. "They are considerably less good at determining why something is happening. The political structure beneath the surface. The human layer, some of my council call it. You need someone who can read people the way I read land," Molly said slowly. "I need someone who already has a reason to be in Coldwater." His pale eyes held hers without apology. "A healer's sister arriving to visit is unremarkable. A king's scout is not." The room was quiet for a moment. The fire in Sarah's hearth popped once and sent a brief shower of sparks upward. "You want me to go in?" Molly said. "I want to offer you an arrangement," Evander said. "You help me understand what is happening in Coldwater. Not as a soldier, not as a spy in the way Doran imagined this morning, but as what you already are. An observer. A woman who reads landscapes, human and otherwise." He paused. "In exchange, you travel north under the king's protection. You reach your sister. And whatever has cut off those supply routes is dealt with." Molly looked at Sarah, who was watching her with those copper eyes and giving nothing away. Then she looked back at Evander and said, "You're asking me to trust you. I met you last night." "Yes," he said, simply without dressing it in anything more. "And if I walk into Coldwater and find something that puts me in danger, then you will not be walking out alone." He held her gaze. "I give you my word." The word of a king, she thought. The word of a man she had known for less than a day. The word of someone who had, without explanation, told his council member that harming her would cost him everything. She thought of Petra's letter. Water damaged. 11 weeks old. A healer in a settlement that was slowly being closed off from the world. "I have conditions," Molly said. Something shifted in Evander's expression. Too brief to fully name, but she thought for just a moment it might have been respect. "Then tell me your conditions," he said. Her conditions were 3. First, her maps remained hers. No copy made without her permission, no use of her surveys beyond the purpose of this arrangement. Second, if the situation in Coldwater became dangerous beyond what she could navigate, she would have the right to withdraw without consequence. Third, Petra, her sister, would be offered safe passage to the king's territory if the settlement proved too compromised to remain in. Evander listened to all 3 without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Agreed," and that was the entirety of the negotiation. It unsettled her more than argument would have. They left for the north 2 mornings later. The party was deliberately small, Evander's idea, and the first serious point of conflict with his council. Doran had stood at the head of the oak table and listed every reason why the king of the northern pack should not ride into contested territory with fewer than 40 armed wolves at his back. And Evander had listened to every word with the patient attention of a man who had already decided and was simply waiting for the speech to end. 5, he said, when Doran finished. Myself, Commander Sarah, 2 of her scouts, and Molly. A small party moves faster, draws less attention, and arrives before whoever is watching the northern roads has time to prepare a response. And if you're ambushed, Doran pressed, then whoever ambushes us will have made a significant miscalculation, Evander said, and closed the meeting. The northern road was a thing of brutal beauty. Molly rode a brown mare named, according to the stable boy who had saddled her, Briar, a name that suited the horse's mild but stubborn temperament exactly. The road climbed steadily through dense pine forest, the trees so tall and close together that the sky above appeared only in narrow strips of pale winter light. The air smelled of cold earth and pine resin, and underneath those, the faint mineral sharpness of snow waiting to fall. The ground was hard and gray-brown, the last of autumn's color pressed flat by early frost. She rode near the middle of the group. Sarah led at the front with 1 scout. The second scout, a young man named Colt, barely older than 20, with watchful dark eyes and a habit of scanning the tree line every 30 seconds, rode at the rear. Evander rode to Molly's left, close enough that she was consistently aware of him without being able to articulate exactly why. He did not speak much on the road, neither did she. But on the afternoon of the first day, when the path narrowed and her mare picked her way carefully around a section of trail undermined by frost heave, he said quietly, "You ride like someone who learned late." She glanced at him. "I learned at 19. Is it that obvious?" You grip the reins slightly too tight on uncertain ground. Someone who learned young stops noticing the uncertainty. He paused. It's not a criticism. Awareness of uncertain ground is generally more useful than ignoring it. She looked at him for a moment. You give a great deal of careful thought to how people move. Movement tells you more than speech, he said. Speech can be constructed. Movement is usually honest. She turned this over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon. They made camp the first night in a natural hollow, sheltered by 3 enormous pines, whose roots had grown together into a raised platform of dark wood and moss. Sarah's scouts built a fire low and shielded, its light contained rather than broadcast. The smell of wood smoke curled upward into the cold air and dissolved into the dark. Overhead, through the gap in the pines, a few stars were visible between slow-moving clouds. Molly sat near the fire with her satchel in her lap, updating her trail notes by firelight. Small, precise marks on a fresh piece of parchment, recording the frost-heave damage on the trail. A secondary path she'd spotted branching east, the particular quality of the soil where the pine roots had broken the surface. She didn't notice Evander settle on the log beside her until he spoke. You're mapping as we travel. I map everything, she said, without looking up. It's not a decision. It's just how I see. A pause. What do you see right now? She considered the question seriously rather than deflecting it. A hollow that's been used as a camp before. See the old ash ring under the new fire? Someone camped here within the last month. The moss on the north side of the largest root is disturbed. Something heavy rested there. She glanced up at the tree line. And there's a trail of broken branches heading northeast, about 40 feet out. That's too deliberate to be animal movement. Someone walked out of this hollow in a hurry, heading toward the high ground. Sarah, on the other side of the fire, had gone very still. She looked at Colt. Colt looked at the tree line. Evander looked at Molly. You noticed all of that since we arrived, he said. I notice things. It's what I do. She returned to her parchment. Someone was here recently. Someone left in a hurry. That's either nothing, or it's the beginning of something worth understanding. Sarah was already on her feet, moving quietly toward the northeast tree line with one hand on the blade at her hip. Colt followed. The fire crackled between the absence they left. You weren't planning to tell anyone, Evander said. It wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I was still deciding if it was significant. She paused. I'm not a soldier. I don't report every observation as though it's an emergency. Sometimes a thing is just a thing. And sometimes it isn't. And sometimes it isn't, she agreed. Sarah returned 12 minutes later with Colt behind her, and an expression on her face that had gone several degrees colder than the night air. She crouched by the fire and looked at Evander directly. Fresh camp. 2 people, maybe 3, within the last 2 days. They left in a hurry. Food left behind, partially eaten. And there's a marker on the northeast tree. She paused. A cold water settlement mark. One of their boundary signs, but inverted. Silence settled over the hollow. Inverted means distress, Molly said quietly. Everyone looked at her. It's an old system, she said. Older than the current settlement council. I mapped the cold water region 2 years ago, before I went south. They use trail markers for communication. Different configurations mean different things. An inverted boundary mark means someone from inside the settlement is trying to signal danger to anyone coming in from outside. She looked at Sarah. Someone ran from this hollow toward the high ground 2 days ago and left a distress marker. They were either fleeing something or trying to warn someone. Evander stood. In the firelight, his face was all shadow and carved attention. How far to Coldwater from here? At current pace, 1.5 days, Sarah said. We move at dawn. He looked at Molly. Can you read those markers as we travel? Yes. Then you ride at the front with Sarah tomorrow. He held her gaze. Not behind the group. At the front. It was a shift in the structure of the party that did not go unacknowledged. Colt's eyebrows moved slightly upward, and then carefully back to neutral. Sarah simply nodded, as though it confirmed something she had already concluded. Molly looked at the dark tree line beyond the fire's reach and thought about Petra. 11 weeks since that letter. A healer in a settlement that was sending distress signals into the winter woods. She pressed her hand briefly against the worn strap of her satchel and held that thought without letting it grow into the thing she was most afraid of. They found the first body the following morning. It was a wolf, shifted, lying in the snow at the side of the trail where the high pines began to thin. He was young, perhaps 20, wearing the rough-woven clothing of a settlement worker. There were no wounds that Sarah could immediately identify. He lay on his side with one arm extended, his hand open, as though he had reached for something in the last moment and not found it. Molly stood at the edge of the trail and looked at the body with the same careful attention she gave to maps. Then she looked at the ground around him. The snow was disturbed in a pattern that she could read the way she read landscape. Something had happened here, and the ground remembered it. He didn't fall, she said. He stopped. He chose this spot. She pointed to a slight depression in the snow several feet back, where the footprints were deeper and more deliberate. He stood here for a while first, looking at something. She followed the sight line. That direction, north-northwest. Sarah looked north-northwest. Her jaw tightened. Molly followed her gaze to where the tree line broke just enough to reveal, distant and gray against the white sky, the silhouette of the Coldwater settlement walls. He was watching the settlement, Sarah said. He was watching something happen inside it, Molly said. And then he fell here, where he couldn't be seen from the walls. Evander crouched beside the body and examined the young wolf's right hand, the extended one, the reaching one. Around his wrist was tied a thin strip of cloth, barely visible against the pale skin. He unwound it carefully. On the inside of the cloth, written in small, shaky letters, with what appeared to be charred wood or dark ink. They are counting the wolves. Everyone who enters. Nobody leaves. Evander read it once. Then he held it up for Molly and Sarah to see. The wind moved through the high pines above them with a long, low sound like something trying to speak in a language that had almost been forgotten. Snow shifted from the upper branches and fell in slow, soft curtains around them. Molly looked at the settlement walls in the distance. Somewhere behind those walls, in a healer's room that probably smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, was the only person in the world who had known her before she became someone who walked alone, with a satchel full of maps, and no pack, and no fixed place. "I'm still going in," she said. "I know," Evander said. He was already standing, already refolding the cloth, already thinking. "So am I." She looked at him, really looked at him, for one of the first times since the council chamber. Not at the armor or the authority or the reputation that walked ahead of him like a second self. At the man inside all of that, who had crouched in the snow beside a dead stranger and read his last message with the same careful attention he gave everything. "You were going to go in regardless," she said. "Even before we found this." He glanced at her. "Yes." "Why?" A pause. The wind moved again through the pines. "Because someone in my territory is counting wolves," he said quietly. "And in my experience, people who count wolves are preparing to reduce the number of them." He walked back to his horse, and Molly stood for one more moment in the cold with the distant gray walls of Coldwater visible between the trees, and understood that whatever was waiting inside those walls, she was no longer walking toward it alone. She wasn't entirely sure how to feel about that. She mounted Briar and followed. They left the horses hidden in a ravine half a mile from the settlement walls in a fold of land dense with young pine that swallowed sound and shadow equally well. Colt stayed with the animals. It was not a decision he argued with, though his dark eyes said clearly that he wanted to. The plan, such as it was, had been constructed in low voices while crouched in the snow beside the trail. Molly would enter first, alone, on foot, through the eastern gate, the smaller one, used by traders and traveling healers and the kind of unremarkable people that settlement guards looked at and then looked past. A woman with a braid and a worn cloak and a satchel, arriving to visit her sister. Nothing about that picture invited scrutiny. Sarah and Evander would follow separately, an hour behind, through a gap in the western wall that Molly had recorded in her survey maps 2 years earlier, a section where the stone foundation had shifted and the repair had been done poorly, leaving a space wide enough for a careful person to pass through sideways. It had probably been repaired since then, Evander noted. Probably, Molly agreed. But probably was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. If something goes wrong before we reach you, Sarah said, do not try to resolve it yourself. Find your sister, stay with her, and wait. And if something goes wrong before you reach me? Molly asked. Sarah looked at her steadily. Then use your maps. It wasn't the answer Molly expected. She turned it over in her mind as she walked the last half-mile to the eastern gate alone, her boots finding the frozen ruts in the road, her breath making small clouds in the still cold air. The settlement walls rose ahead of her, gray stone, old, the mortar darkened by years of northern weather. The gate itself was heavy timber reinforced with iron bands, and it was open, which was the first thing that felt wrong. Settlement gates in winter were kept closed against the cold. Everyone knew that. There were 2 guards at the gate. They wore the Coldwater badge, a circle of pine branches around a running wolf, but something about the way they stood was off in a way she couldn't immediately name. Too still, too watchful. Not bored the way gate guards in a quiet settlement were bored, but alert in a manner that suggested they were looking for something specific. She walked toward them with her hands visible and her pace unhurried. Purpose of visit, said the taller guard, before she had fully stopped. My sister is a healer here. Petra. I've come to visit. She kept her voice easy. I've been traveling 3 days. I'd very much like to sit by a fire. The guards looked at each other. That glance lasted 1 second too long. Name? Said the second guard. Molly, of the Southern Road Settlements. She paused. Is there a problem? I've visited before, 2 years ago. It's been a difficult season, the tall guard said, in the tone of a man reciting something he had been told to say. We're careful about who enters. I understand completely, she said. And then, because she had spent 4 years reading landscapes and the people moving through them, I notice you're not recording arrivals in your log. She nodded toward the wooden post at the gate's edge, where a leather-bound record book hung on an iron hook. It was closed, undisturbed, the way a record book looked when it hadn't been opened in days. The settlement master usually requires it. Has that policy changed? The tall guard's eyes sharpened. She had pushed 1 inch too far. She saw it happen. The slight recalibration behind his eyes, the way his weight shifted forward. Go ahead, he said instead, and stepped aside. She walked through the gate with her spine straight and her satchel held close, and the strong sensation of eyes following her across the threshold. She did not look back. The inside of Coldwater was quiet in the wrong way. She had been here before, 2 years ago in high summer, when the settlement had been a place of ordinary noise, traders arguing prices at the central market, children running between the stone buildings, the ring of a hammer from the smithy, the smell of bread from the communal ovens. Now the market stalls were closed. The central square was nearly empty. The few people she could see moved quickly, and without making eye contact, their heads down, their cloaks pulled tight. The smell was different too. Wood smoke, yes, and underneath it something stale and close, the smell of a place that had stopped breathing properly. She found the healer's house on the eastern side of the settlement where she remembered it. A long, low building with dried herb bundles hanging above the door and a small window that let out warm amber light even in the gray morning. She knocked twice. A long pause. Then, "Who is it?" She recognized the voice. The tight, careful, controlled version of it. The voice Petra used when she was frightened and refusing to show it. But underneath that control, the familiar tone that had called her name across a dozen different rooms in the years before they had both gone their separate ways. "It's Molly," she said quietly. "Open the door, Petra." The door opened. Her sister was 28 years old and had their mother's dark gold hair and their father's stubborn jaw, and she was thinner than Molly remembered, her face carrying the particular hollowness of someone who had been sleeping badly for weeks. She wore a healer's apron over a gray wool dress, and her hands, steady, always steady, healer's hands, gripped the doorframe for just a moment before she stepped back to let Molly in. The room smelled of dried lavender and pine pitch and something medicinal that Molly couldn't name. Herbs hung in thick bundles from the low ceiling. A work table ran the length of one wall, covered in small clay pots and folded cloth, and the organized chaos of a healer who was running low on supplies and stretching everything further than it was meant to go. Petra closed the door and turned around, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the small, warm room. "You're here," Petra said. Her voice had lost its careful control. "I'm here," Molly said. They crossed the room and held on to each other the way people hold on when they are the last certain thing in an uncertain world, briefly and completely, and then stepped back because there was work to do, and they were both people who understood that comfort and urgency could not occupy the same moment for long. "Tell me everything," Molly said. Petra told her. It came out in pieces, not in order, the way truth comes out when it has been held in too long. 3 months ago, a new man had arrived in Coldwater. Not a settler, not a trader. He had presented himself to the settlement council with documents signed by a regional authority that none of them had thought to verify, claiming appointment as an oversight representative from the Eastern Territories. His name was Renfell. He was soft-spoken, well-dressed, and within 6 weeks, he had quietly replaced 2 council members with his own people, redirected the settlement supply contracts to traders he controlled, and begun requiring that all wolves entering or leaving the settlement be logged, not in the gate record book, which was visible, but in a private ledger that only Renfell and his associates could access. "He's building a list," Petra said. Her voice was flat and precise, the way she spoke when she was containing something large. "Every wolf in the settlement, their abilities, their pack history, their allegiances. He asks questions, careful, friendly questions, and his people write down the answers." "For what purpose?" Molly asked, though something cold in her chest suspected she already knew. "I don't know exactly. But last month, one of the wolves on his list, a young man named Finn, barely 20, tried to leave to visit family in the south. He wasn't allowed through the gate." Petra paused. 3 days later, Finn was found on the northern road, collapsed. No visible wounds. Her healer's eyes held something steady and terrible. "I examined him. I know what exhaustion from forced shifting looks like. Someone made him shift repeatedly over a short period. It's used as punishment, or as a method of..." She stopped. Molly thought of the young wolf they had found on the trail. His reaching hand, the cloth around his wrist. "Petra," she said carefully. "The young man who collapsed on the northern road. What did he look like?" Petra described him. Molly closed her eyes for one breath. Then she opened them. "He didn't collapse," she said. "He died. We found him on the trail this morning. The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved along the settlement walls with a low, patient sound. Petra sat down heavily on the stool beside her work table. She pressed both hands flat on the wood surface in front of her, her healer's habit, grounding herself, and breathed. "Renfell has to be removed," she said finally. "I know." Molly crouched beside her sister. "And that's going to happen. But I need you to tell me one more thing. His documents, the ones he presented to the council when he arrived. Did anyone keep a copy?" Petra looked at her. "I did," she said. "I didn't trust them from the beginning. I made a copy before he took the originals back." She stood, crossed to the far wall, and lifted a loose stone from the base of the fireplace. Behind it was a folded piece of parchment. Molly took it and read it carefully. The seal at the bottom of the document was Eastern Territory. Correct. The authority signature above it was a name she didn't immediately recognize. But the format of the document, the specific phrasing of the appointment clause, the particular way the territorial boundary was described in the authorization language, she had mapped those territories. She had spent weeks in those lands, reading their boundary markers, talking to their administrators. This document did not match the way the Eastern Territory wrote its official appointments, not in one small detail, but in a dozen of them. The language was close, very close, close enough to deceive someone who hadn't spent years in those lands. But it was constructed by someone working from second-hand knowledge of how such documents should look. "It's false," she said. Petra stared at her. "The entire appointment is fraudulent." Molly set the document down on the work table. "Renfell has no authority from the Eastern Territory. He never did." She looked at her sister. "He came here because Coldwater is isolated enough that no one would quickly verify his credentials, and because he wanted access to the wolves here without the king's knowledge." A sound outside. Both women went still. Then a knock at the door. 3 beats, a pause, 2 more. A pattern. Molly exhaled. She crossed to the door and opened it. Evander stood in the doorway with Sarah behind him, and Snow on his shoulders, and his pale eyes already moving past Molly to read the room in one swift sweep. The gap in the western wall, apparently, had not been repaired. He looked at Molly. She held up the document. "I know who Renfell is," she said. "Or rather, I know who he isn't." Evander stepped inside. He took the document, read it in the same focused silence he had given her map in the council chamber, and when he looked up, his expression was the quietest and most dangerous she had seen it. "You read this from the document format," he said, "not from the name." "The name means nothing to me," she said. "The format means everything. I've been in those territories. I know how they write." He held her gaze for a moment that was exactly long enough to communicate something she couldn't quite translate but felt clearly. Then he turned to Sarah. "Find Renfell. Bring him to the settlement hall, quietly." He paused. "And find out where his private ledger is kept." Sarah was already moving. Evander looked back at Molly. "You," he said, "stay with your sister." "I found the evidence," she said. "You did." A pause. "And now I need to act on it." "Those are 2 different skills, and I have no intention of putting you in a room with a man who kills wolves for information." His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something solid that she felt rather than heard. "Stay with Petra." She wanted to argue. She didn't, because he was right. And being right while being infuriating was one of the more difficult combinations to argue with. She stayed. The settlement hall was the largest building in Coldwater. A long timber and stone structure at the center of the square. Its roof high enough that the smoke from its central hearth rose and spread before reaching the rafters. In better times, it served as meeting place, feast hall, and communal shelter during the worst of the northern storms. Now, with Sarah's quiet efficiency and the cold authority of a king who did not need to raise his voice to fill a room, it became something closer to a court. Renfell was brought in within the hour. Molly watched from the doorway of Petra's healer's house, close enough to see the settlement hall's entrance, far enough to remain where she had promised to stay. She had not promised not to watch. Petra stood beside her, arms crossed, her healer's eyes cataloging every detail with the same patient precision she applied to her patients. Renfell was not what Molly had imagined from Petra's description. She had built a picture of someone visibly dangerous, hard-faced, commanding, the kind of man whose threat announced itself in the way he moved. Instead, he was perhaps 50, slight, with thinning gray hair and a wool coat of good quality, and an expression of polite confusion that he wore the way experienced deceivers wore expressions, as a tool rather than a reflection. He walked into the settlement hall between two of Sarah's scouts, with the bearing of a man who believed the confusion would resolve itself in his favor. It did not resolve itself in his favor. Molly couldn't hear what was said inside. The hall's heavy doors had been pulled mostly shut, and the wind moving along the settlement walls carried sound away, rather than toward her. But she could read the shape of events in the way people moved around the building's entrance. A scout emerging to speak quickly to another and then disappearing back inside. One of Renfell's own associates being escorted firmly across the square toward the hall by a guard whose posture left no room for objection. 20 minutes after Renfell entered the hall, a scout came across the square to Petra's door. "Commander Sarah asks for the healer," he said, "and the mapmaker." The hall smelled of old pine smoke and tallow candles, and underneath those, the particular tension of a room where something had just broken open. Renfell was seated at the long central table. The polite confusion was gone from his face. What remained in its place was something smaller and harder. The expression of a man reassessing his options and finding them reduced. Sarah stood to one side with the private ledger open on the table before her, its pages covered in columns of names and notes written in a cramped, precise hand. 3 of Renfell's associates sat against the far wall under guard, their faces arranged in various configurations of sullen resignation. Evander stood at the head of the table. He had not sat. Molly was beginning to understand that he very rarely sat in situations like this, that standing was, for him, a deliberate choice, a way of making clear that a conversation had not yet reached the point where he was willing to settle into it. He looked at Molly when she entered. A brief look, assessing, checking, she realized, that she was unharmed. Then his attention returned to the room. "The document," he said, and Molly set the copied appointment paper on the table. Renfell's eyes moved to it. Something shifted in his face. "You presented fraudulent authority documents to the Coldwater Settlement Council," Evander said. His voice was level and unhurried. "You replaced elected council members with your own associates. You restricted movement in and out of the settlement without legal authority. You compiled private records of every wolf in this settlement, their abilities, their histories, their vulnerabilities." He paused. "And a young wolf named Finn died on the northern road after being subjected to forced shifting, which this ledger confirms was used as punishment for attempting to leave." Renfell said nothing. He was looking at the fraudulent document with the expression of someone calculating distances. "Who are you working for?" Evander asked. A long silence. The candles guttered in a draft from the high windows. Snow had begun to fall outside, and it ticked softly against the glass. "You won't find them," Renfell said finally. His voice was quiet and precise, the voice of a man who had decided that cooperation was no longer strategically interesting. "I am one piece. You've found the piece. The rest of the structure is elsewhere, and removing me does nothing to it." "That," Evander said, "is the most useful thing you've said." Renfell blinked. "You've confirmed there is a structure. You've confirmed it extends beyond this settlement. And you've confirmed that you believe it's intact and operational." Evander picked up the ledger, examined one page, set it down again. "Everything in this room, your documents, this ledger, your associates, and your own account of events, will be reviewed by my council and the Eastern Territorial Authority, whose seal you stole." He looked at Renfell with the calm, complete attention of someone who had stopped being uncertain some time ago. "You will answer for Finn. You will answer for every name in this ledger that you placed in danger, and the structure you're so confident about will be found. Not by you telling me where it is, but by the paper trail you've left behind in the territories you traveled to construct this fiction." He paused. People who build fraudulent documents always leave a trail. They can't help it. The details they get wrong are always the same details. He glanced at Molly on that last sentence. Not long, just a flicker of acknowledgement. She understood. The document format. The 12 details that didn't match. The trail she had read the way she read frost patterns in early spring ground, not the thing itself, but the evidence the thing had left behind in passing. Renfell was escorted from the hall. The room exhaled. What followed was not dramatic. That was the part that Molly would remember most clearly later, how the restoration of a broken place was mostly quiet work, done in steady increments without ceremony. Sarah spent the rest of that day and the following morning going through the ledger name by name with Petra, who knew every wolf in Coldwater by face and history. Together they built a picture of what Renfell had been compiling. Not just names, but a specific kind of name. Wolves with rare abilities. Wolves whose pack histories were complicated, or whose allegiances were unclear. Wolves who could be pressured. The ledger was not a census. It was a recruitment list, built for someone who needed leverage and capability in equal measure. The settlement's 2 replaced council members were restored. The supply routes, strangled not by geography, but by Renfell's deliberate redirection of contracts, were reopened with letters from Evander's seal that no Eastern trader would be slow to honor. The gate was closed and restaffed with people Sarah personally approved. On the second evening, Molly sat with Petra in the healer's house, with a fire burning high and 2 cups of something hot and bitter that Petra called a winter tonic, and that tasted primarily of pine bark and determination. The herb bundles overhead threw soft shadows on the low ceiling. Outside, the snow that had begun during Renfell's reckoning had settled into a steady fall, and the settlement was quieter than it had been in weeks. Not the wrong kind of quiet. The held-breath quiet of a place under pressure, but the right kind. The quiet of a place that had set something down. "You came," Petra said. It wasn't quite a statement. It had the shape of something she had been holding for a while. "Of course I came," Molly said. "It took you 11 weeks. I had to cross a military boundary, get arrested by the Alpha King, negotiate an arrangement, ride 3 days through early snow, and read a fraudulent document by pattern recognition." She looked at her sister over the rim of her cup. "I came as fast as I could." Petra looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, brief and sudden and warm. The laugh Molly had known since childhood, and it filled the small room the way fire fills a cold space. Evander found Molly the following morning at the eastern wall. She was standing on the low walkway above the gate, looking out at the northern landscape. The pine forest dark against the white ground, the sky a clear pale gray that promised cold without storm. The road south visible as a thin dark line between the trees before it curved and disappeared. She had her satchel open and was making notes, recording the settlement's boundary markers, the condition of the wall, the sight lines from the eastern approach. Her fingers were cold, and her breath made small clouds in the still air. She heard him on the steps before she saw him. He moved quietly for a large man, but stone stairs were stone stairs. He came to stand beside her at the wall and looked out at the same landscape without speaking. He had left his fur mantle somewhere. He wore only the leather armor and the crossed chest straps, seemingly indifferent to the cold in the way of someone whose body ran warm and always had. "You're mapping the settlement," he said. "Updated survey. The eastern approach has changed since my last visit. There's a new drainage channel dug along the outer wall, and the gate position has shifted slightly north. She didn't look up from her parchment. Also, the gap in your western wall is now officially documented as a security vulnerability, which I thought you might want on record. The gap we used to enter. The very one. She finished her notation and looked up. The pine forest stretched out before them, vast and patient and indifferent, the way large wild things were. What happens to Renfell? He'll be taken south to face proper authority. His associates as well. Evander's voice was even. The Eastern Territorial Courts will handle the fraud charges. The matter of Finn, the forced shifting, falls under pack law, which is my jurisdiction. And the structure he mentioned? The one he said extended beyond this settlement? A pause. That, he said, is what concerns me more than Renfell himself. He turned slightly toward her. The ledger is being analyzed. There are names in it that suggest this was not an isolated effort. Someone built this with a purpose larger than one settlement. His pale eyes moved to the tree line and back. I don't yet know the shape of what we've found. She understood the weight of that. One piece removed from a structure that was elsewhere, still intact. A thread pulled from a larger cloth. You'll need accurate maps of the territories where Renfell traveled, she said carefully. To trace the trail you mentioned, the document construction, the supply contract redirection. All of that happened somewhere. In offices, in meeting halls, in places where records exist. He looked at her. I have surveys of most of those territories, she said. 4 years of them. She held his gaze steadily. And I know how to read what a place has been through. Not just what it looks like now, but what it's been used for. Who moved through it, what they left behind. The wind moved gently between them. Snow shifted from the top of the wall and fell in a soft curtain past the gate below. The arrangement we agreed to, Evander said, was for cold water. Yes, she said. It was. Another pause. He was reading her the way she suspected he read everything, carefully without rushing, looking for what was true beneath what was visible. What are you proposing? He said. She had been thinking about this since the night in Sarah's map room, when she had spread her surveys across the oak desk and watched something shift in the face of a woman who had never expected to be surprised by a mapmaker. She had been thinking about it since the council chamber, when a king had looked at her work and said it was the most accurate survey he had seen, with the tone of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. She had been thinking about it since 4 years of walking alone through territories that needed understanding, recording what she found for guilds that paid poorly and valued her less, for packs that hired her work without hiring her. I'm proposing a permanent arrangement, she said, not a transaction, not an exchange of services for safe passage. She kept her voice even and direct, the way she had kept it in the council chamber when she listed her conditions. I would work with your scouts, formally, with standing, with the same authority to act on my findings that Sarah has on hers. The Northern Territories need accurate maps. You need someone who can read what maps don't show. And She paused, and for a moment something honest moved through her face. I need somewhere that my work means something to people with the power to act on it. Evander looked at her for a long moment. The pine forest spread out behind him, enormous and silent. Your 3 conditions from before, he said. They would carry forward. They would. And you would want a formal position, not a consultant, not a temporary appointment. I would want to be what I am, she said, without the qualifier of having no pack and no standing. I would want my name in the record books as something other than an Omega without allegiance. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might need time, might ask her to wait, might want to bring it to his counsel and hear Doran's predictable objections, and weigh it all in the careful, deliberate way he weighed things. Instead, he said, "Done." Just that. The same single word with which he had agreed to her original 3 conditions, delivered with the same absence of ceremony, as though the decision had been made somewhere earlier, and he was simply now reporting it. She breathed out slowly. "You didn't consult anyone." "I consult people when I'm uncertain," he said. "I wasn't uncertain." She looked at him, at the man who had read her map in 7 seconds and told the truth about what he found there, who had crouched in the snow beside a dead stranger and read his last message with care, who had told his council member that touching her would cost him everything, who had listened to her conditions and agreed without negotiation because he had decided they were reasonable, and that was simply that. "You're a very unusual king," she said. "So I've been told," he said. They rode south 4 days later, Evander, Sarah, Molly, and Colt, and behind them, a proper escort of 8 additional wolves that Sarah had arranged with characteristic efficiency. Renfell and his associates traveled in the center of the group, bound and quiet, their wool coats doing insufficient work against the northern cold. Petra stood at the cold water gate to see them off. She had been offered safe passage south as per the original arrangement, and she had declined it with the same quiet certainty she applied to everything. "I'm a healer," she said, when Molly raised an eyebrow. "And this settlement needs one, particularly now, while it repairs." She had hugged Molly once, hard, and then stepped back and looked at her with their mother's eyes in their father's stubborn face. "You'll come back." "I'll come back," Molly said. "And you'll bring better maps." "I'll bring better maps." Petra looked past her at Evander, who was waiting with his horse at a courteous distance, speaking quietly with Sarah. She looked back at Molly with an expression that was careful and warm and full of a sister's particular brand of knowing. "He agreed to all your conditions," she said. "He did. And then you gave him more conditions." "I gave him a proposal," which he agreed to immediately. "He did," Molly said. Petra's mouth curved. "Good," she said simply, and stepped back through the gate. On the second day of the return journey, when the pine forest had thinned enough to show a wide gray sky overhead, and the road had smoothed into the lower territory trails, Sarah rode forward to deal with a question from one of the escorts, and Molly found herself beside Evander again in the easy, unplanned way that seemed to keep happening. They rode in silence for a while. The cold was less sharp at the lower elevation, and the sky had taken on the particular pewter brightness that came before snowfall. Not yet snow, but the promise of it, held close to the earth. "Doran is going to object," Molly said eventually. "Doran objects to most things," Evander said. "It's his primary contribution to the council. It keeps us from moving too quickly." "But you move when you decide to move." "I do." She looked at the road ahead, the curve of it between the gray-brown trees, the frost still clinging to the north-facing ground where the sun hadn't reached. She thought about what it meant to have a direction, a fixed point to navigate from, a place where your work was recorded in the official ledgers under your actual name. "I've been a cartographer for 8 years, she said. "I've never had a title. I've had contracts." "You have a title now," he said. "Chief Territorial Surveyor of the Northern Pax." He paused. "I decided on it this morning." She looked at him. "You decided on it this morning." "I had time while you were updating your Eastern Wall survey." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very long title." "It is accurate," he said. "Which I understand is important to you." She turned back to the road before he could see what her face did with that. They reached the King's Keep on the evening of the second day, as the promised snow finally arrived, soft and steady, falling straight down in the windless dark, settling on the stone battlements and the courtyard torches and the worn shoulders of a gray wool cloak that needed replacing. The keep's great doors opened at their approach, warm light spilling out onto the snow-covered courtyard, and grooms came forward for the horses, and the escort moved in organized efficiency around the prisoners, and Sarah was already issuing instructions to 3 people simultaneously while walking and not breaking stride. Molly dismounted and stood for a moment in the courtyard, with snow falling around her, and Briar's warm breath against her shoulder, and the sound of the keep alive and purposeful in every direction. She thought of 4 years of roads, of contracts that ended, of guild offices that thanked her for her maps and her Omega classification, in the same polite tone that made clear one canceled out the other. Of the letter from Petra, water-damaged and partial, that had sent her north into a military boundary in the dark before dawn, with nothing but a satchel and the stubbornness of someone who had run out of alternatives. Evander passed her on the way to the doors, then stopped. He looked back at her standing in the snow. "The room they gave you before," he said. "It's been kept for you." She looked at him. "How did you know I'd come back?" "I didn't," he said. "I kept it anyway." He went inside. Sarah followed, still talking to 3 people. Colt led the horses away. The snow fell steady and quiet on the old stone of the courtyard, filling in the tracks they had made with white, patient certainty. Molly stood for one moment more in the cold. She pressed her hand against the worn strap of her satchel. 4 years of maps, all the territories she had learned to read, all the frost patterns and trail markers and inverted boundary signs and fraudulent document formats that had led her here, and felt the weight of them differently than she had before. Not the weight of things carried alone, the weight of things that had somewhere to go. She walked through the doors and into the warmth and light, and they closed behind her, solid and certain, like the last page of a map that had finally found its edges. The story of Molly, the Omega without a pack who walked alone through the northern territories for 4 years and read the world more clearly than anyone who had thought to look, did not end there, of course. It continued in the record books of the northern packs, where her name appeared under the title Evander had decided on that cold morning on the road, and where her surveys formed the foundation of every territorial decision made in the years that followed. Renfell was tried and convicted by the Eastern Territorial Courts. His associates received lesser sentences. The structure he had hinted at, the larger organization that had sent him to Coldwater, was uncovered over the following year through exactly the paper trail Evander had described. The document construction, the supply contract redirection, the 12 details that didn't match. Molly's knowledge of the territories he had moved through proved essential, and each discovery was recorded in her hand on fresh parchment and added to the official archives. Doran objected formally to her appointment. Evander heard the objection in full, and then confirmed the appointment in writing, which Doran signed as required by council procedure, in an interaction that Sarah later described as the most efficiently unpleasant 3 minutes she had witnessed in 8 years of service. Petra remained in Coldwater. The supply routes reopened, the settlement healed slowly and steadily, and the healer with their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness became one of the most trusted figures in the northern settlements, the kind of person that people traveled difficult roads to reach. She and Molly exchanged letters regularly, and twice a year Molly rode north with updated maps and stayed long enough for pine bark tonic and real conversation by the fire. Sarah remained commander. She and Molly developed, over time, the particular friendship of 2 people who communicate primarily through competence, through work well done and observations accurately made, and the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill every space with sound. It was, Molly thought, the most efficient friendship she had ever had, and she valued it completely. And Evander, the Iron Wolf, the Alpha King, the man who had read her map in 7 seconds and told her the truth about what he found, kept his word, every condition, every promise. He moved when he decided to move, and he waited when waiting was right, and he listened to her observations with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the person reading the landscape was as important as the landscape itself. On a morning in late spring, when the snow had gone from the courtyard and new growth was pushing green through the gray stone cracks, Molly stood at the long oak table in the council chamber. Her maps spread across it, the new surveys of the Eastern Territories where Renfell's organization had operated, the updated northern boundaries, the corrected Ashvin Ridge charts, and presented her findings to a full council. When she finished, Evander said simply, Good work. Doran said nothing. Sarah nodded once, precisely. And Molly rolled her maps back into their order, the order she knew by touch, the order that was hers, and felt something settle inside her, with the quiet, definitive certainty of a landmark finally placed correctly on a chart. She was exactly where the map said she should be. And for the first time in a very long time, she was certain that this was not a contract with an end date. This was home,